All right, so moving on to the next segment, I'll be sharing my top 5 ethnicities of all time in the UFC. So these are my top 5 ethnicities in UFC history. So I'll be ranking I have my list from number 5 going all the way down to number 1 of my top 5 ethnicities in UFC history. So at number 5, I have American fighters. Now, when it comes to ethnicities, American fighters in the UFC have been very successful. And American fighters do have a history of being successful in the sport. You look at fighters like John Jones, who I do believe is the GOAT of UFC history. You look at a natural athlete in Brock Lesnar, who only took him 3 to 4 fights to become a world champion in the UFC. You look at Dustin Poirier, one of the greatest fighters in UFC history, to never win a world title. You look at Tony Ferguson, when he did on his run from 2011 to 2019 in the UFC. You have Stipe at the heavyweight division, who's one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. Pretty good UFC careers that all those respective fighters I just said and mentioned had in the UFC, and that makes American fighters in my top 5 of ethnicities in UFC history. And number 4, I have Australian fighters. I do believe that Australian ethnicity is the 4th best ethnicity in UFC history. Fighters like Alexander Volkanovski, who is one of, if not the greatest featherweight champion in UFC history. You see the ability, his striking ability. Alexander Volkanovski is pound for pound one of the best fighters in the UFC today. Robert Whittaker is nothing to sneeze at. Also, Robert Whittaker has been a dangerous threat in the UFC for years as well. A great Australian fighter, all-rounded, well Australian fighter as well. Kerry of France is a name to add to the list as well. Casey O'Neill, Jake Matthews, all Australian fighters have been great in the UFC. Those fighters I just named and just mentioned are one of the reasons why I do believe that Australians are one of the greatest ethnicities in UFC history as well. They're number 4 on my list. At number 3, this one's debatable, but at number 3, I have Nigerian fighters. Now, there's not a lot of Nigerian ethnicity fighters in the UFC that have taken over the sport like Americans or Australians, but Nigerian fighters have to be considered in anybody's top 5. We talk about top 5 ethnicities in UFC history. Nigerians had taken over the UFC over the last few years. You look at what the 2 kings of Kamaru Usman, what he did at the welterweight division, having one of, if not the greatest welterweight championship run in UFC history with several 4 to 5, 6 different title defenses. Kamaru Usman took over that division. And then you look at the other Nigerian king, Israel Adesanya. He took over that division, the middleweight division, and made that title mean something, just like an all-time great did Anderson Silva did years ago in the middleweight division. Those 2 Nigerian kings, what they did and took over the UFC for years was special. So they're number 3 on my list. Nigerians as number 3 on my ethnicity list. That's a tongue tie. That's a tongue roller. So bear with me now. Number 2, I have Brazilian fighters. I do believe that Brazilian fighters are number 2 on my ethnicity list of all time in UFC. Brazilian fighters actually are the most accomplished ethnicity in UFC history. You look at Anderson Silva, one of the all-time greats. I just said he did wonders for that middleweight title and that middleweight division in the UFC. Became one of the greatest in UFC history. You look at Royce Gracie. You look at Jose Aldo. You look at Alex Pereira, who is a 2-time division champion in the UFC today. Christine Cyborn, what she did in the women's division for years. She's a legend herself. Amanda Nunes, in my opinion, the greatest women's MMA fighter in MMA history for what she did in her illustrious Hall of Fame career. You look at Charles Oliveira for what he's done in the lightweight division, one of the greatest lightweight champions in UFC history. The list goes on how great Brazilian fighters have been. The Brazilian ethnicity to me is number 2 of all time on the UFC list. But number one, the greatest ethnicity in UFC history is Russians. Russian fighters in MMA are ruthless. They are very aggressive. They are very dangerous in that octagon. And Russian fighters are really great grapplers. They're great strikers. They're nearly flawless and nearly unbeatable in that octagon. Russians, to me, is the number 1 ethnicity in UFC today. They're nearly unbeatable. You look at Khabib, what he did in the lightweight division. To me, the greatest lightweight champion in UFC history. He took out names of Conor McGregor. He took out names of Tony Ferguson. He took out names of Dustin Poirier. Gaethje. The list goes on and on. Islam Makhachev, what he's doing in the lightweight division right now. He's kicking asses and taking names. He's pound for pound, to me, the greatest UFC fighter in the sport today. Khamzat Chimaev, up-and-coming rising star in the UFC that just defeated Kamaru Usman, that fought him on a 10-day notice. Russians are very dangerous. They're very ruthless. They're very aggressive. I do believe that they are the greatest necessity in UFC history. But those are my top 5 and ethnicities. I said the word so many times in this segment, but you guys get the point. Those are my top 5 UFC ethnicities in UFC history.